Please welcome Dan, Robert, and Dale to the S4 main stage.
So I've been looking forward to this debate quite a bit because I know we have two passionate debaters here. The question is, what is more appropriate for an asset owner with ICS and Enterprise Secure Operations Center? And Dan Scali will be taking that side, or should you have a specific OT Secure Operations Center? And Rob will be taking that side, and we'll do it pure debate style. I guess the only thing I want to point out is that they are strong advocates for this position. They do each believe in their positions, but there's usually a little more nuance. But I said we don't want the nuance. We want you guys to butt heads, so give the strongest possible argument for your side. The second thing is we're admitting up front that either solution requires some level of OT expertise in whichever type of SOC you pick. So that's not a point of contention. That's agreed upon. So if we could turn the lights up, I'd like to get a preliminary vote here. So, tall hands, because it's kind of hard to see out there. How many people believe that an enterprise SOC is the right way to go going into the debate? Okay, hands down. How many of you believe that an OT-specific SOC is the right way to go going into the debate? That's close. I think we're a little heavier OT SOC. And do we have undecideds at this point? A couple undecideds. Okay, well, perfect for you guys. Okay, so I think Dan, you won the toss. So Dan is going to go first. There's 10 minutes on the clock. Make your argument.
All right, thanks, Dale, and forgive my note cards. I didn't want to forget that important fourth or fifth thing. So Dale said it was really important to take clear sides, but I do want to say that I think there are a lot of hybrid approaches that can work, but the good news is that I'm right in all those hybrid approaches. I wanted to start off by just kind of defining what an enterprise SOC is. So I think the first key point is, it's one organization, right? And that, I think, will be key to the discussion that we're going to have going through. It covers both IT and OT. And then, it's certainly possible, as I said, in those hybrid approaches where I'm right, to have a specialized group in the enterprise SOC, that focuses on OT, and, the reverse of that, where you can have an OT-focused SOC, but it's the only SOC in the organization, right, which by definition is an enterprise SOC. And so if you're going to have an OT SOC, you really have to be doing two things. You have to be doing only OT, and you have to be a separate organization by definition. So the argument for an enterprise SOC, four things. First, most attacks that we've analyzed as an industry have come from the IT side and started on the IT side before they impacted OT. Second, the appropriate response to an ICS cybersecurity incident is going to have aspects on both the IT and the OT side. Third, it's more cost-effective. And then fourth, the SOC is going to require, as Dale said, both a blend of IT and OT skills. And I'll make the argument that it's more efficient to learn OT skills and awareness in this particular situation than to upskill in other areas. So first on why most attacks are the point around the fact that most attacks start on the IT side. So look at the examples that we have. The German steel mill, Ukraine, Havex. Stuxnet is a notable exception, but remember that the enterprise SOC also covers OT. So that type of incident or attack would be monitored for. And I think the key point here is that if you're monitoring just OT, you're too late. And you don't have to believe me on that. So I wanted to sort of lend some credibility to that argument. So I went and looked at the literature, and I found a SANS white paper by one of my favorite authors on this topic, Rob Lee. And in that white paper, he says, to accomplish such an attack requires adversaries to initiate a two-stage attack against an ICS. The multiple stages or exaggerated kill chain provide additional opportunities for defenders to increase the adversary's cost of an attack and to position themselves to detect and disrupt attackers before they reach their goal. And then he goes on to say, stage one most directly maps to what would constitute a breach in traditional IT networks. So I think there's a significant lost opportunity if you're not monitoring the IT environment and also with the context of how those breaches can eventually translate later on in the kill chain, right? So you want to take that opportunity to disrupt the attack as early as possible in the attack lifecycle. And then last thing is, ICS attacks are not necessarily ICS specific attacks. And I can remember a time where I was working with an engineer and he was really fixated on secure configuration of the OSI Pi server in his environment. And then we later, during our assessment, found out that the guest wireless network had a route into the chemical facilities DCS network. And so a point that I may return to is that just the focus on the ICS specific nature of the attack can blind you to what's actually the risk to ICS, which could actually have an IT or a commercial off-the-shelf sort of software component. Point two, you need enterprise-wide coordination. So in leading a number of tabletop scenarios, one of the most frequent things I see as a breakdown is when IT and OT have to work together on coordinating an incident. And so certainly by separating the SOC into two separate organizations, it's suboptimal, right? Because now you've created that coordination and that need for a handoff where the ball can potentially be dropped. So you need that single coordinated view in that time of crisis and when responding to an incident. And I would even say, outside of times of crisis, having that unified message to leadership, to the executive committee, from a technical function is also critically important. My third point is that it's most cost effective to have the enterprise SOC. So, if you're going to have an IT SOC and then you're going to have an OT SOC, you've at a minimum increased your cost and effort required, right? Because you're building two essentially, sort of parallel capabilities, or potentially you've even doubled it or more. And then, also, of course, remember, if you have a SOC and it's only focused on OT and you don't have an IT SOC, that's actually an enterprise SOC, right? Because you have one. And then, of course, there's the issue of scale, right? So if you have a number of sites, are you going to put an analyst at each of these sites? Are you going to have, data that resides only at each of those sites and is never correlated with what you're seeing on the IT side, or is never correlated even across sites? So if you see any value to correlation, right, even across the OT side, I think that is also a strong data point in favor of having an enterprise SOC. And so last point here is that it's easier or more efficient to close the skills gap in an enterprise SOC. So I think we'll all concede here that any smart person can learn new skills, whether they're technical skills or other skills. And to me, this really comes down to a question of efficiency. So if IT people in an enterprise SOC, what's the barrier there? I think it's an awareness barrier, right? Essentially, you need some OT sensitivity training, right? You need, the understanding of how not to do things, to break, the operational environment. And then, essentially the ability to recognize, hey, this is something that doesn't look good or looks like evil, and it's time to call the experts, right, and work with the OT team. And that's not something that has to be done only in an incident. Proactively, you can build joint playbooks and response capabilities and build a joint incident response plan that covers different types of technologies. On the flip side, if you have an OT-only SOC, and the implication there is that you're going to have OT people with that primary skill set that are staffing that. Now you're talking about not an awareness barrier, but a skills barrier, right? And in effectively responding to a cyber attack, there's skills like reverse engineering malware, and understanding various IT protocols and technologies. And so certainly that's something that can be learned, but I would argue that it takes a longer time and more effort and study to learn than just simply awareness and when to identify something and work across organizational lines, or in the case of the enterprise SOC, it's even easier, right? Because you're all one organization. So, lastly, why the Enterprise SOC? So, I'll frame it this way. I believe that the OT SOC is actually a missed opportunity. It's a missed opportunity to stop attacks earlier in the attack lifecycle. It's a missed opportunity to gain full visibility into attacks that span both IT and OT and to reduce the risk of a dropped handoff. It's a lost opportunity to save money, or even worse, it's a lost opportunity to justify the cost of having a SOC in the first place and to gain that capability in your organization. And then lastly, and I think most importantly, the OT-specific SOC is a missed opportunity to have a skilled IT and OT security team working together. Thank you.
Okay, let's put 10 minutes on the clock. We're good?
All right.
Take it away, Rob.
All right, so I was excited for this one because I actually really like Dan, and I really like his team. And I usually feel really bad about debating people I don't like because it's like, oh, well, maybe you're right, and okay. But for someone I love, I'm happy to say you're just absolutely wrong. So I will articulate why it's important. When you look at what a security operations center is, by its very definition, it is an operations-based focus. And I'm not to do a coy OT sort of parallel there, but on the aspect that you have a mission focus. Many other organizations, if we just start of what an enterprise SOC is, look at that based on what their mission lines are. As an example, if we look at Microsoft, Microsoft has actually done very well to do security over the years. I think if we look back to the 90s, we wouldn't have had that answer, but if you look back at the past couple of years, they do a fantastic job. At Microsoft, they don't have one enterprise SOC. They actually have over a dozen. For every individual product line they have, they treat it differently because the mission of that product line is different. Azure is protected differently than O365. They understand that there's a distinct mission. It's not easily summarized into confidentiality, integrity, availability. I always like that one when I hear it. I always see people come in, yes, well, in ICS, it's availability, integrity, confidentiality. No, and actually it was Dale that made this point a couple years ago when I heard it, and he said, well, high-value IT actually is very similar sometimes to the requirements that we have in industrial. The Amazon EC2 cloud server, CIO, really cares about the availability of cloud. So it's not about 3 letters, it's about mission. What is your mission? What are you trying to accomplish? When we look at the requirements for a security operations center in the enterprise, one of the metrics that we usually measure them on is adversary dwell time. Can I understand how long my adversary is in my environment and minimize that as much as possible? It's not stop every intrusion, but let's not have a 365 or 400-day intrusion. Let's think in hours or in days. That's our mission. When I look to the operations side of the house, 2 of the things that I think about are mean time to recovery and root cause analysis. When I'm looking at what's going on in the industrial environment, we're thinking about the resilience, the reliability, the safety of our equipment and our operations and our people, and we're trying to think, how do I reduce how long it takes me to get back up and running, no matter the events. When I look at the playbooks that I'm going to be running after something happens, whether it's a fault in the line or a disruption in the process, I look at root cause analysis. What actually caused this? And unfortunately, there's plenty of cases, and many of the cases they actually cited, where the root cause analysis was thought to be an IT problem, or maybe it was just a random fault, when in fact there was adversaries at bay. We heard about it with the Trisis discussion, or Triton. Definitely not Hatman. All right, so when it first started, though, the discussion was, oh, well, there's an issue. Just a fault, probably okay. Maybe we should investigate this. Getting to root cause analysis, to that cyber component of it, that forensics component of it, is a place in the community that we're not really good at yet, and we've got to get better. Our requirements are different, the operations to which we run are different, the ways to which we staff that are different. Now, I'm not saying that you should not have great coordination between your enterprise and your OT folks. And I'm not even saying that they can't have a lot of the same skills and training that goes into it. When you are dealing with a malicious capability in the industrial side of the house, you are going to want reverse engineering skills. That's completely fair to say. But the focus that I put on it and the approach that I'm going to take is absolutely different. And I also don't want the same reporting chain. So this was not a foundational aspect of my argument, but Dan brought it up, and so I'll sort of go to that end and say I actually don't want that. And most of you can appreciate that. How many times have we said as a community, just thinking enterprise, well, to have a CISO report to a CIO, I don't know if that's going to get me the best security because they have different mission focuses. We've probably at least heard that argument at once upon a time, and it's a good argument. We want to make sure that security doesn't get measured on availability in the enterprise, because that's not necessarily the same mission. By the same extension, I will say, based on what we're trying to do in the operations environment versus IT, we do want to have a separate focus. Now, that does not mean doubling the cost. I do not think you need to have a beautiful SOC with big screens and pew-pew maps flying back and forth and 50 people. That is not what a SOC is. Now, that is the perfect world for consultants to come in and sell you that SOC, but that's not what a SOC is. A SOC is a mission-dedicated focus of people training for it and readying themselves. To give you an example, previous life working in the intelligence community, when we built a operations center, one of the operations centers that first started popping up around 2004, and then my co-founders and I helped build another one, was a threat operations center. We didn't even call it a SOC. We called it an operations center that was focused on threats. So instead of getting through tickets and tailoring firewalls and trying to make sure that the security was done, our operations focus was to go out and find new adversaries, new tradecraft, understand what they were doing and what that meant for defense. It was confusing to folks because by all means it was just a SOC. It was a security operations center by any other color. But it was confusing to folks, so we had to relabel it, and everybody's always good at marketing. So internally we called it a threat operations center. That operations focus, again, I will say, is critical to your mission success. We started seeing new adversaries that we'd never seen before, new threat actors that nobody ever anticipated. Why? Because back in the day, when the DoD was focused on this, they were looking at what was breaking into DoD networks. They were thinking Iran, China, Russia. That's who the landscape was. And you'll probably remember, less than a decade ago, that was your threat actors, Iran, China, Russia. Well, how come we weren't seeing NSA teams? How come we weren't seeing Pakistani-based APT teams? Why? Because I wasn't an Indian energy company or a Chinese energy company. Collection was wrong for those threats. So our collection focus in the Department of Defense networks was on Department of Defense networks and the type of threat actors that were targeting them. So we missed a lot of other threats. The indicators from those threats would be silly to evaluate. The Pakistani team breaking into the energy company in India, not going to have the same indicators. But the tradecraft to which they use would absolutely be useful for defense. If we sort of scale that back to this discussion, right now we do not know our ICS threat landscape. When there still was an ICS cert, the ICS cert's metrics that would come out every year, I always like to point out that the #1 attack vector into the industrial side of the house every single year, as measured by the ICS cert, was unknown. The #2 was spearfishing. Everyone's like, yeah, phishing, except for we don't have a lot of email servers in DCS and SCADA environments. What they were saying was, if we saw it, it came through the enterprise, or we have no idea how it's here or what it's doing, which means we're not learning, we're not codifying that, we're not factoring that into MTTR and RCA. I would say we need to understand our threat landscape, we need to put a dedicated focus on it, we need to understand what we're going up against and modify that and modify ourselves appropriately. It is going to go through and enterprise at one point. So when I wrote that paper, and Dan so eloquently cited it, thank you, Dan, talking about the ICS cyber kill chain, Mike Asante and I wrote that paper years ago. We talked about a stage 1 effect will likely have an IT footprint first, but that does not mean it is your enterprise. We have a lot of remote connections in our industrial environments. The #1 attack vector I see is not phishing emails, but usually remote connections through TeamViewer, VPNs, et cetera, to vendors, contractors, consultants, and others. If you are just building an enterprise SOC to watch that, I would reverse what Dan said and say, actually, you will more likely miss what is going on because you can't have an enterprise SOC in everybody else's enterprise. We need to take a focus for our operations. We need to have a mission-driven focus. We need to appreciate that our mission is different, but that does not mean not talking. The IT-OT culture gap kind of arguments that come up every year, that is not appropriate. They should absolutely train together. They should absolutely play together. Just like an incident response team. Many people think, well, I have an incident response plan, then I'm gonna call the incident response team and they'll come in and all be okay. And they never coordinate ahead of time, they never plan, they never meet and greet each other. They get on site, day 1 of the incident is not the time to learn who your responders are. The same way on the operations side of the house. OT and IT SOC, or OT and enterprise SOC, should absolutely be tied at the hip in culture, not in mission, not in approach, not necessarily even in technology, not in what they value. In an enterprise level SOC, we will generally have a bunch of tier 1 analysts, a bunch of tier 2 analysts, and some smaller amount of tier 3. Tier 3 tends to be a very specialized skill set, so what most companies do is centralize as much as possible those tier 3. And an OT SOC would actually position that is backwards. I'm okay centralizing and sharing across a major utility or a major global manufacturing, tier 1 and tier 2 kind of escalation. But when it gets specialized, I want my tier 3 to know that plant. I want them to know those plant managers. I want them to have those relationships. I want them to understand that process, understand that equipment. I can't just centralize that into a global team. So I would articulate to you as I leave you now to get back into the debate. It's all about the mission. Your mission is going to be different. In your company, you may have different missions. So between IT and OT, just appreciate what your mission is and what you're trying to accomplish. I think there's a very clear one here, but yours may not be as simple as just 2. Understand how you approach that, understand the people, but don't think it's just going to double costs. Don't think it's going to be doubling personnel. Even a couple smart people with a dedicated focus can do a lot of value for your dedicated mission.
All right. You know what? I was sitting there, you guys are doing such a good job that I thought I would change the rules on the fly. So we're going to go to the rebuttal now, as planned, but then after the rebuttal, I will give each of you an opportunity to ask each other one question. Okay? So just so you have time to think about that over the next 10 minutes, no pressure. Okay, so now that we're in the rebuttal phase, each one of them gets 5 minutes to punch back at what they heard. And Dan, you lead off.
All right, cool. So I'm just going to kind of go rapid fire through a couple of points that I wrote down there. So the first is on the operational focus or the mission, and the example of having multiple SOCs and multiple missions. My counter to that is if you bring it up to a high enough level, what organization actually as a whole doesn't have a mission or has competing missions within the organization? I'd say that's a larger organizational problem, and certainly if you have one organization, that organization should have one mission, and I think that leads back to the enterprise SOC argument. If you need coordination, and Rob did say how important coordination was multiple times, then why separate these groups organizationally? So now you set the stage for political battles, right, and disagreements, and not having really a one-team focus. Another concern was, well, you're really going to have this enterprise SOC that has to have an OT component reporting into IT. Well, that's not always the case, right? And this is really about what's the most effective organization for the SOC to be effective. Should the SOC be, should you have 2 SOCs or should you have 1 SOC? And I think, that having them together, again, is the most critical thing that you can do to increase that collaboration. And also, the security team doesn't necessarily have to report in to IT, right? That's the case in many organizations, but you could also argue that if you have an organization with a critical OT footprint, that maybe you should have a standalone cybersecurity organization. I know that many organizations do organize that way. Another point that was made, you need an OT focus and perspective or else you're going to miss things. Well, nothing in the enterprise SOC model prohibits you from having a specialized pod of OT analysts that actually work with the people at the plant or across the fleet or whatever you're monitoring that understand all the ins and outs and the threat model for each facility and are really responsible for watching that area of the infrastructure. And I think that parlays also into another point that was made around remote connections, right? So those can be just as easily monitored, right? I mean, it's really a technical perspective, right? You're going to put a sensor on the ingress-egress point into the OT environment. You can also just stick a sensor at all these remote access points. And then lastly, I think the point around, the specialization, right? And because this is so specialized, right? Why would you centralize that? Because you need to have these people out at every facility. I think the counter argument to that is, where are you going to find all these people, right? So if this is a specialized skill set and a specialized talent and something that's hard to find, then centralization is actually the best way for you to scale out that level of expertise, right, across the organization. So in closing, again, I wanted to get some quotes. You don't have to believe me, believe some external sources. So I turned to my favorite comic book strip, actually, to make my final point. And so in Little Bobby, week 136, from September, September 3rd, 2017, the operator says to Little Bobby, we should collect and analyze the ICS serial traffic for APTs. And then Little Bobby says, have you already done analysis of the OT systems? The operator says, no. And Little Bobby says, start with the most likely targeted systems, like the HMI or remote VPN client. And so I think this really kind of illustrates the point of the Enterprise SOC is, riddle me this, Batman. Why would you focus on things like a remote VPN client? That's actually IT technology. And I think that there's a starting point here that is broad and looking across the organization for simple things, right? Like, are there any devices on the OT network that are trying to access the internet? What types of traffic are we seeing coming through these different remote connections? And a lot of these, are traditional IT problems, as Rob pointed out. And so if you have that OT-specific focus, there can be a downside of that blinding you, again, to thinking that, well, attacks are only coming from OT-specific types of technologies, versus the broader IT technology set. Thanks.
Okay, 5 minutes on the clock. Go.
So I know this is a hard concept for Dan, but engineering workstations and HMIs are in the ICS. So Little Bobby doesn't disprove my point there. I do want you to start with what's easier. That's fine. But I don't want to paint a world for you that is based off of, well, it's easier to go this direction. So in Dan's points, a lot of them based on, well, it's hard. We're not going to find these people. We'll reduce money. I don't think those are the ways that we paint what we want to get to. Those might be the path you take. They will be barriers in your way. But I want to paint a picture for you of what it looks like to do right. If you can't get to a perfect state, that's fine. Move in that direction. It's okay not to be perfect. Some organizations will decide that they don't need a SOC at all. That's not the problem. But on a debate of what does right look like, it's not about easy. It's not about it's difficult to train these folks. It's about what satisfies my mission requirements. And when we look at, again, from the focus of those technologies, it's not about the fact that it's a Windows system. It's an HMI or an engineering workstation, and it has a different impact on my ICS. It's not about the fact that it's an IT technology being a VPN. It's about what it carries into my environment, what it carries out of the mission importance of having that access when I need it, and not necessarily when I don't. It's not about the data. In an enterprise world, it is always a component about the data. I need to understand my information and secure my data. That is not our mission on the industrial side of the house. It may be important. Data is definitely important, intellectual property and all sorts of things around it, but it's not the mission. So just because they are IT boxes does not mean that I'm going to give them over to the IT staff. It does not mean, though, that I need barriers. I'm not encouraging barriers between IT and OT. Again, I think you should be connected in some way, at least culturally. But I would also note the idea that you all have one big mission at the top of your organization is a little bit folly. If I walk into American Airlines, they could probably give me a mission statement of, I really believe in ushering passengers to their destination safely and on time. They might have some simple mission statement like that. But everything underneath that is going to require specialization to some degree. American Airlines takes credit cards. They have a financial processing team. They're going to satisfy customers. They're going to have customer requirements. They're going to have maintenance lines with manufacturing equipment with both industrial control systems as well as IIoT. They're going to have that a different focus. They're going to deal with ground-based radar stations outside of their scope of what they're dealing in their enterprise. They're going to need to be aware of that. That one organization might have one mission, but underneath that, we do want elements of their teams to have different missions to satisfy them directly. So I appreciate Dan making my point that even though it might roll up eventually, some level it's going to be one person. Sure, eventually somebody's in charge. That does not mean we just combine everything together. It would be silly outside of a security context. I think it's silly inside of a security context. I would take that one step further to say I do not need 50 security operations center analysts to do the mission. A couple smart people can accomplish it. One well-trained engineer that understands what security means to their operations can be extremely potent. I know of a gas pipeline company. They're here. I don't know if they want to talk about themselves this week, but they can give you their experiences. They built an operations dedicated OT SOC. That OT SOC, I think, has 3 people. And they are awesome at doing their job for the reliance and the safety of their gas operations. He usually likes to joke that his job is to pass gas. I would say it is generally to do security. But either way, I would say that that focus was small, it was cost effective, and they trained up into it. They didn't just instantly expand. I think in any organization, if you think that you're going to double in size or go 300% more people, you're going to have stumbling blocks. But if I can hire 1 or 2, or I can take internally 1 or 2 and train them up on the mission requirements and what they're focusing on, and teach them that it's not about the data, it's not about the VPN that I can just throw monitoring on, but it's about what it means to my operations, they can have a lot of impact in your organization. They can also help break down those culture barriers, because we still do have some of that IT/OT friction. What better way than having somebody that lives and breathes and understands operations, be able to be that ambassador to understand security as well as what you're trying to do on the engineering side. So again, I would say a dedicated focus is appropriate for the type of infrastructure that we run and the criticality to our society. Even if it's not critical infrastructure, they're usually critical to local communities, and I think they should be treated as such.
Okay. So let's, rather than me asking questions this time, you guys are doing so well, Dan, I'll give you a chance to ask Rob a question, then we'll let him reciprocate.
Well, my real question is, I wore my suit. Why didn't you wear your steel-toed boots for this conversation
well, I
to
feel
really play the roles?
jeans represented my position, though. Yeah.
We were joking about that earlier. But, I guess my question, just kind of cuts to the real world, and you made a point at the end there around, look, this is really important, right? And so we need, to invest in it and get, people that are specialized, right, out into the OT-specific SOC. I agree that this is really important, but my question from a practical perspective is, what would cost more, an enterprise SOC or 2 SOCs that are IT and OT?
Yeah, great question. So again, I don't know that it's appropriate to focus only on cost. I think the cost of loss to operations or safety is probably going to impact you more. But if we're just looking at a cost of having an enterprise versus an OT SOC, I don't know that the argument actually holds up on it's going to cost a lot more. Because if you're saying I need OT specialized people anyways, then I'm still going to staff them in the enterprise SOC. So there will be increased cost by at least having a different reporting. But I don't advocate bureaucracy and having a bunch of other reporting chains. So will it be an increase? Absolutely. But I don't think a 2x is a fair representation. I would say I wouldn't even say it's a nominal kind of increase if you're doing it in a small footprint. So I don't think it actually comes down a lot to cost.
Okay. And now you have a chance to ask Dan a question.
Yeah. So I still didn't even come up with a question. But Dan, as somebody
Yes,
I like, so when you go and have incident response for your organizations, do you feel it's important to have a dedicated ICS incident response that has autonomy, or would you just roll them into another incident response team and not have that focus?
So I think, and this is where I get into the hybrid models, right? And again, where I think in the hybrid model, I'm right? Because that's an enterprise. And I would say that you'd want a pod, right? And that's actually how my team's organized at Mandiant, right? Where we have, ICS specialists, but, we'll basically go out and report, right? And work with, an IR team, right? That specializes and has done a number of investigations. So that's right.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. Let's, if we could, turn the house lights back up. Let's see if we changed any minds.
That was fun.
I know this is a fertile crowd, so please raise your hand up high if you believe an enterprise SOC is the best way to approach this for an asset owner. Okay, thank you. And now raise your hand up high if an OT SOC is the right way to approach this for an asset owner. Okay, and now, were there any changes or undecideds that made up your mind? Raise your hand. At least we had 2 or 3. Okay, well, thank you very much. I looked, I think, guys, the OT SOC had a higher percentage at the beginning and a higher percentage at the end. So
Irrelevant.
So,
still a good point either way.
So it was a great argument. I don't know if we changed any minds, but I really appreciate it. Please give them a round of applause.
Hey, man. That's good.
Well
Good
done.
stuff.
Well, thanks, guys.